So in 2006, I moved with my family from my sweet life in Berkeley, California, and my company, and went up to the Gates Foundation to help start a new team up at the Gates Foundation. It was 2006. It was right at the time that Warren Buffett gave his amazing gift, doubling the size of giving every year. And the foundation had reached a point where they wanted to be more systematic in the way that they were doing their strategies, measuring results, and so forth. And so I went up there to help build a team at the time called Impact Planning and Improvement that would help all of the programs in the Gates Foundation to be more strategic, be more measuring more the results. And then there was a third part of the remit of my post, which was to help the foundation hear from outside voices. So 2006, we're up in this pretty bucolic, beautiful place in the Pacific Northwest. One of the first things that I did in that hearing, helping us to hear from outside voices, was engage with the Center for Effective Philanthropy to help the foundation hear from grantee voices. So how could the foundation systematically hear from the nonprofits that were receiving funding from the foundation? And what was so amazing about that experience with the Center for Effective Philanthropy was the Grantee Perception Report that CEP commissions accounts for the fact that people like getting grants. Nonprofit organizations like getting grants, so they tend to rate you on the pretty positive end of the scale. So when you get back that feedback, you're thinking, wow, 6s on a 7-point scale or 5s on a 7-point scale, that's pretty good. But what they did was they used all the benchmarks from their other foundations so that you could actually truncate the top of the scale and see where there were differences between what your grantees rated you and what other grantees of other foundations rated them. And so you got some sense of, on a percentile basis, how are we doing? And I was so impressed with the Center for Effective Philanthropy and how they were able to make that feedback data really meaningful to the foundation. And I was sitting up in my beautiful office in this beautiful place up in the Pacific Northwest, and I had a kind of a feeling in my gut. It was a very visceral feeling that we were really far away from the people that we were seeking to help with our funding. We were far away from the farmers in Africa. We were far away even from the students in the high schools that we were funding at the time, the small schools. And I thought, hearing from outside voices, maybe we should try to hear those voices. Maybe we should try to hear not just our grantee voices, which were really important. We were doing pretty good at hearing from experts, which I think also are pretty important. So I think it's actually not, we don't want to be anti-intellectual in this movement and anti-evidence and anti-expert. But I did feel like there was a pretty important set of voices that we were missing. And so I went around and I talked to different programs who were doing work, and I got some traction and some interest in the US program. And the US program was, at that time, the education program was investing in small schools. Many of you might remember that strategy. The foundation had invested in, at that time, about 2,500 small schools across the country, creating new small schools, rearranging large schools to become small schools, but never had the foundation actually listened to the students in those small schools. Gates is very data-oriented. They collected data about lots of different dimensions of the school experience, graduation rates, matriculation rates, grades, test scores, and so forth. So I approached the team in the U.S. program. I said, would you be interested in trying to listen to your end beneficiaries? And they said, yes, we would. And then we talked about, well, who would that be? Would we listen to parents? Would we listen to teachers? And we decided, no, let's listen to students. Okay, so we started what at the time was called the Student Voice Initiative, and we got a group of folks together, and I remember we had a conversation with David Bombright at the time, who sort of was a great champion for this in the early days, and decided, let's bring in the Center for Effective Philanthropy. They were so good at helping the foundation hear the voices of grantees. It's so hard to get foundations to pay attention to things like this. Let's see if the Center for Effective Philanthropy would be interested in working with us on the Student Voice Initiative. So I approached Phil Buchanan at the time, who is the president of the Center for Effective Philanthropy, and I said, what do you think about helping us as a philanthropy hear from the voices of students? And he said, wow, that's really important, but it's really hard. And we talked about it, and they decided to work with us. We were really fortunate because Valerie Threlfall, who's at the back of the room, was the first executive director of what became Youth Truth. We designed Youth Truth with the Gates Foundation staff, with different grantees, with people who were running schools, superintendents, principals, students, youth development leaders, researchers, somebody from MTV. We had all kinds of people around the table to really help us shape what would be a robust student feedback loop. We started off with just sort of a feasibility approach. Let's try to do this in 20 schools. And we did it in 20 schools, and it was successful. It was feasible. We brought the schools together in Seattle for conversations. What could they learn from each other? CEP, through their what became then called Youth Truth, used their same approach in terms of analytics, created benchmarks so the schools could compare their results across different questions to other schools, and they could see where am I doing well and where are you doing less well, and they could learn from each other for purposes of improvement. The kind of questions that were included in that feedback loop were questions like, are your teachers fair? Do they give you help if you need it? Do you feel safe in this school? The Youth Truth is continuing. It's now in hundreds of schools. Youth Truth has surveyed almost 500,000 students. I'll tell you one story of change in a school, because one of the things that has been remarkable about Youth Truth is how much attention the school leaders have paid to the data and how much change they've brought about as a result. So I'm going to tell you the story about Dr. Brendan Sapp, who is a principal, a school leader in Taylor Mill, Kentucky. He's a relatively new principal. He brought Youth Truth into the school, and across the board, across almost all the dimensions of the survey, they scored near the bottom percentile, his school. It was really devastating for him. But the question that haunts him the most was the question, do your teachers care about you? And they scored in the first percentile, 1. Do your teachers care about you? This is your school. He was really devastated, as you might imagine. But he didn't leave it at devastation. He brought that data back to the teachers, back to the students, and they talked about it. And what was interesting, and I think this is an interesting point too, is that as he was seeking to understand the result, what happened and why, tell me more. Amy Costello yesterday was talking about tell me more. It was interesting that they found that there was some group of students, that it was like the AP students, that actually were quite upset with the result. They liked the school. They were happy with the experience that they were having, but the majority of the students weren't happy. And that's data too, right? You get back mixed results, you have to make sense of it. So they made some changes. They focused on culture change in the school. And They began to invite students to faculty meetings to talk about improvements. They began to have monthly meetings with the students to talk about what can we do to make this a better environment. What can we do to help strengthen the relationships, to help strengthen the school experience, to make it a safer, a better place. And they made a lot of change. So when they started, the failure rate at the school was about 25%. 2 years later, the failure rate had dropped to 5%. So that's an extreme example, but it's an example of schools across the nation who are using this feedback tool from students to really drive change. Schools, networks, districts, and statewide systems. But remember the beginning of the story? The beginning of the story was I wanted to help the foundation hear outside voices to help inform the Gates Foundation's work. That is a less good ending, I would say, because by the time this whole feedback work got going, the Gates Foundation had actually shifted its strategy. It was no longer focused on small schools. Now it was focused on a different strategy, on a systems change strategy, on a policy, informing new kinds of policy strategy, and it backed out of the small school strategy. So listening to student voice then felt less relevant, and there were new people, and it just didn't happen. That voice never penetrated that philanthropic glass ceiling. So that's really the challenge. The end of the story is that these voices are really important. They're finding their way into a process of change in the school community, the school environment, but they haven't yet broken through that glass ceiling of philanthropy. And that's the challenge I leave you with, and I don't have the answer to. And that's when Dennis says we all have to actually do this together. We do. And so maybe a year or 2 years from now, and this isn't just about Gates, it's actually about philanthropy in general. How do we break through that glass ceiling, help bring in outside voices, the most important voices, into our considerations for the future?